Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today, we're going to be talking about transcendental arguments, what they are, what this methodology is, what it can offer us, if anything, and then some criticisms of it. I have with me Dr. Adrian Bardon, and he wrote the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on this, so we're going to be talking about that a little bit. Before we jump in, I want to thank the Patreon supporters, the patrons. You guys are awesome. Really, really excited. I'm able to buy some new equipment because of some of you guys. And all of you are contributing and helping me. This is huge. If you guys have benefited from this podcast at all, please consider becoming a Patreon patron, a supporter. You can find the link in the description here or the audio. Another way is to go on YouTube, subscribe, leave me some comments. Those always help. It helps the algorithms. AI are running our lives now. So leave me a like and a comment, all that stuff, and then go to Apple Podcasts for if you really like the show, and leave me a 5-star review and a comment. That would be huge. So without further ado, let's jump in on some transcendental arguments. What are they? What can they offer us? All that good stuff. So I'll bring Dr. Bardon in. Dr. Bardon, thanks so much for coming on the podcast to talk about transcendental arguments, even though your current study has been on philosophy of time and science denial and other subjects.
It's a pleasure to be here, Parker. You've got a lot of really awesome videos on your channel.
Oh,
and,
thanks.
they're worth watching.
Man, I really appreciate that. Well, I wanted to start off just by asking, how did you get into philosophy at all? Yeah, how did you end up becoming a professional philosopher?
Oh, gosh. Well, my freshman year in college, my roommate was taking a philosophy class, and he left a copy of Spinoza's Ethics sitting on the table.
Wow.
And I picked it up. I was like a poli-sci major. So I picked it up and I looked at it, and in about 10 seconds, I knew I was going to be a philosophy major and get a PhD in philosophy and teach philosophy. I didn't understand a word of it, but I just knew that wow, I didn't realize you could just sort of think about, the most fundamental questions about the universe and just just try to tackle them, just sit down and get to work on them. And yeah, that seemed like the thing to do.
Wow, man, that's quite a story. Well, how'd you
It was quick.
Yeah, so where'd you end up doing your PhD at?
University of Massachusetts.
Okay. And what was your dissertation on?
It was on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which his refutation of idealism specifically. So that relates both to issues about time and transcendental arguments, because that's the argument form.
Yeah.
In Kant.
Okay, well, that's perfect then. Yeah, that really set the trajectory for your life here. Why'd you pick that? Was that something your advisor suggested, or did you already have an interest in Kant?
I was definitely already interested in Kant. Also from the get-go as an undergraduate, I read it. I didn't understand any of it, but it looked like it was super interesting.
Right.
And I was always interested in time and our consciousness of time. It seems to me at the very heart, if you're thinking about like your reality itself, time is at the bottom of it. And if you're thinking about our connection with reality or consciousness, it seems like time consciousness is at the bottom of that.
Yeah.
So I like to get to the bottom of things, and it looks like time is where you want to be.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's really fascinating. I hope that we can get to some time after dealing with transcendental arguments, especially because they're connected like that in Kant's project.
Mm-hmm.
So you wrote the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on time, or sorry, on transcendental arguments.
Right.
How'd you come to study those? You talked about Kant and stuff, but how did you get picked as you're the transcendental argument guy?
Well, I started studying it in connection with Kant. Kant is the not necessarily the ultimate progenitor of the argument form, but he certainly developed the argument form, and is linked to it, much more so than any other particular person you could name. So the core arguments in the analytic section of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is the section that I'm interested in, many of them kind of more or less take the form of what we would now call a transcendental argument.
Mm-hmm.
How did I wind up writing that encyclopedia article? I'm not entirely sure. Either I might have proposed it, or a friend of mine who also does Kant might have proposed it on my behalf. It was one of those two things.
Okay, nice. Well, so before we get any further, maybe it'd be best to define transcendental arguments. Can you help us out with, what are these things?
Okay. So transcendental arguments are anti-skeptical. Now what we refer to by skepticism is going to cover a whole wide range of things. So let's take our classic, Cartesian external world skepticism, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we really know that there's things outside of us? So the transcendental argument approach to that skepticism would be to show or to demonstrate that the skeptic is committed to something that could not be the case. Usually this refers to some kind of like capacity or knowledge that the skeptic agrees that he or she has.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of capacity, that cognitive capacity or knowledge, would be impossible without the existence of those very things that the skeptic doubts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now so for other forms of skepticism, that gets that general form kind of gets applied. You're skeptical about the possibility of rational argumentation or morality, or consciousness, and then but then you show that the skeptic is committed to something that somehow entails, in a weird kind of modal sense of entailment,
Mm-hmm.
a special kind, the existence of the very thing that is doubted. And then there's a subcategory of this, which is what we call a performative transcendental argument, which says that the very performance of the skepticism, the very articulation of the skepticism, actually itself demonstrates the falsity of the skeptical attitude.
Yeah.
Okay, so how's that so far?
Well, that's great. And your paper, Performative Transcendental Arguments, and this is something you worked on a long time ago, but it's been really helpful thinking through self-falsifying statements, self-stultifying, self-reference type stuff. So that's been really helpful for me, thinking through transcendental arguments and even using some different language. All this language is so obscure, like we were talking about offline. It's a really niche area of philosophy here. I wonder if you could, maybe we could talk about a couple different transcendental arguments to give the listeners who are totally lost some help. In your article in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you say that the cogito, and that's why I have Descartes as our background. The cogito is a form of transcendental argument. Can you explain that? Just the thought behind that, because everyone will know. I think, therefore I am. It's in our culture now.
Okay, so Descartes says something along the lines of the meditation that I know that I exist anytime I consider the proposition as to whether or not I exist. Mm-hmm. So I think it was Jaakko Hintikka in the 70s was the first one to say that this kind of looks like a transcendental argument.
Oh, wow.
And it is very like, I don't think Descartes would really object to just slightly rephrasing that as saying like, okay, well, if I'm skeptical that I exist, I'm thereby committed to my own existence. Therefore, my skepticism is self-defeating.
Yeah.
The end. So that's a very simple one. And whether or not it works is another question.
Right. Well, yeah, maybe we could stay on that. Like, do you think that's convincing? Do you think that's a transcendental argument that actually establishes what it sets out, the existence of the thinker?
I think I would probably go with and I want to say it's Bernard Williams on this one, saying that, well, if there's I can show that if I'm thinking, or if I'm considering whether or not I exist, I can conclude that thought is happening. Mm-hmm. There's some process happening. Now to go from thought to a thinker as this sort of metaphysical substance, especially in the Cartesian substantivalist notion of the self, that seems to require further steps.
Sure.
So no, I don't think you get to go straight from thought to thinker.
Okay, that's interesting. So his transcendental argument, though it's in that form, would you'd say would fail. You also in your
I
article.
think it fits in terms of the form. I think it
Sure.
works as an example of the form.
Yeah. Okay. You've given some examples in that great paper, Performative Transcendental Arguments, of different self falsifying statements and self stultifying stuff like that. So I took some shots here, some screenshots, because I thought they're really helpful to think through. So another common one besides Descartes' cogito is Aristotle's
Right.
proposed TA on non-contradiction, and some philosophers in the SCP um, have also considered this a transcendental argument. And you mentioned it here. So I'll just quote really quick. The principle of non-contradiction is false. If true, there would be no reason to believe any thesis, including this one. So whenever affirmed, this proposition is either false or irrational. And that's from Aristotle's Metaphysics. What do you make of that? Is that a transcendental argument, or is that just like a self-stultifying or self-falsifying statement? How would you categorize that one?
I think you could call it an example of a transcendental argument. It's just a matter of like phrasing.
Okay.
If anytime you're sort of any case where you're like trying to point out that someone who's skeptical about something is engaged in some kind of self-defeating or self-falsifying process, I mean, you can call that a transcendental argument, and you could write it up such that it sort of meets that form.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessary to use the phrase transcendental argument in, looking at that statement on Aristotle's. But it's more interesting to look at the commonalities between that argument from Aristotle and some other kinds of anti-skeptical arguments.
Yeah.
And then we call sort of all of those fall under this sort of rubric that we could call the transcendental argument.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, what do you make of Aristotle's reasoning there? Do you think that we can like indirectly prove the law of non-contradiction, or does that fail like Descartes?
Well, there's a kind of retort anytime you have this claim as to such and such skepticism is self-defeating. The skeptic seems to always have an alternative, which is just to ask, okay, what's your basis for claiming that the principle of non-contradiction is always in effect? And now the skeptic does not have to assert the principle of non-contradiction is false. Indeed, that's really not. That would be a very kind of dogmatic skepticism in the first place.
That's a good point.
You're more like questioning, what the other person's, evidence is for something, or the reason for holding it, the rationale for holding it, and so you don't have to get yourself into that self-falsifying bind.
Okay.
It is an odd thing to say to assert the principle of non-contradiction is false. It does puts you in an odd place.
Yeah. That's a great point. I don't know if I've ever really considered that it's kind of this wooden skeptic that's maybe a straw man that's blanketly just making that statement, which is easy to try and turn back on them, but usually they're asking a question. So I wonder, there's another one that I found in studying Augustine, which seems like maybe Descartes just ripped this right from him. But Augustine is talking with the academicians of his time who turn out to be skeptics to, Plato's chagrin. I'm sure he's rolling in his grave because of that. But they say, what if you're mistaken about all your beliefs? And that seems more like in line with what the skeptics are saying. And if we're believing the testimony here, it is what they said from the academicians. And Augustine says, well, if I'm mistaken, then I still exist. So I can't be mistaken about that. Si faller sum in the Latin.
Si faller sum. That's in De Trinitate, right?
I think it might be from City of God, but I saw it in, they had an excerpt in Against the Academicians.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it could be from De Trinitate, but that one seems like it's successful to me. Because they're saying, look, you could be wrong about everything. And it's very, very close to Descartes. But he's saying, look, even if I'm wrong, I exist because I'm the one who's wrong. And to me, that seems like a successful TA. But again, maybe it fails. Maybe it reverts back to there's thinking going on. What do you make of that one?
Well, yeah, it's the same thing. And if I was told, I don't know the source on this, I was told that Descartes was accused of having ripped that off from Augustine.
Okay. Yeah,
That's out there somewhere, but I can't remember the source on that.
that's good.
Yeah. Well, once again, when he says, si fel or sum, if I err, I am.
Hmm.
So I can't be wrong about my own existence. Therefore, I'm not wrong about everything. Okay. Therefore, the skeptic is wrong in saying that I can't know anything to be true.
Right.
I think that's the full elaboration of what's going on there. Okay.
Hmm.
Well, when he says I am, once again, is he referring to some sort of, some kind of spiritual substance that endures through his different mental states? That would be a inference that I wouldn't think he's entitled to.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that getting to full blown or some sort of substance dualism from there is an extra step and needs more arguments and stuff. But what about just the existence of the self, like whatever we want to say that is, or maybe we don't want to say anything about it, just that I exist. I'm a thinking thing without saying anything about our substance.
There's thinking going on.
Yeah.
I'm willing to agree that I know for sure at any point when I'm considering whether or not there is thinking going on, I can be sure that there is thinking going on.
So yeah, okay.
But when as Hume said, what is that thing that thinks? Let me reflect upon that. Well, I don't see anything. When I open the inner eye of introspection, I can't see anything except the thoughts themselves.
right. So it would be an extra step to say, well, thinking's a property, and properties, there are no uninstantiated properties. Like that would be a few extra steps, I guess, to get to like a substance dualism. That's an interesting line. I gotta chew on that one some more.
There's definitely some more steps required of some kind. I don't
Yeah.
know why thinking is a property, but for example, yes, you're going to need a few more steps to get to Descartes' spiritual entity.
So could you just say, well, thinking presupposes a thinker? Maybe it's another step in a transcendental. So it's a two-step. No good.
Well, I don't. It's not self-evident that thinking presupposes a thinker.
Hmm.
Where once again, I think when you're saying thinker, you mean some kind of substance that endures through and is identical through, one's lifetime or through the different thoughts that you're having.
Okay.
That's once again, that's what Hume says. Like you have no basis for saying that. All you know is that there's thinking going on.
Hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
I remember certain experiences, and I don't remember, other people's experiences. So there's something special about the experiences that I recall,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm able to just kind of string them together in a coherent way. But again, there's this sort of metaphysical, spiritual realm where this sort of entity persists. I have a good reasons. It's not a transcendental argument, but I have good, empirical reasons for thinking that there's a sort of enduring physical item.
Mm-hmm.
The body, that thing endures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Dr. Bardon, could you be mistaken that you exist then? Like, since you think this one fails, could you be mistaken that you exist? Could someone prove to you that you don't exist?
Well, what is the self? Like, could I be mistaken that a Cartesian self exists? Absolutely.
Hmm.
I don't even know what that thing is.
Yeah.
I positively don't believe in those things.
Uh-huh.
Could I be mistaken that my brain exists and is active in some way? Maybe. I guess now we're getting into some kind of brain in a vat or
Yeah.
matrixy type stuff
Sure.
right there.
Yeah.
Or I'm an AI or something.
Yeah. But if someone tried to convince you, this is why I think that just the intuitive nature of Descartes, if someone tried to convince you that you don't exist, you would still have to think about those thoughts. Like something, whatever it is, whether you're a physicalist or a supernaturalist, or there's got to be a Dr. Bardon that's thinking about those thoughts. So yeah, there's thinking going on, but I don't know. Yeah,
If it would be a matter of trying to convince you, like there's no, you're mistaken. There is no thought process going on right now.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that would be different. But saying therefore I am,
Mm-hmm.
and once again, I think we keep trying to like sneak in this sort of Cartesian self here.
Uh-huh.
I don't have any basis for thinking that thing exists at all, much less having it be indubitable for me.
Okay. But someone could not convince you that there's thinking going on, for instance.
At any time when I'm considering the question as to whether or not there's thinking going on,
Mm-hmm.
there must be thinking going on.
Right.
Sure, I'm on board with that.
So that's indubitable in that moment when it's going on.
Yeah, but of course that's not what Descartes said. Descartes
Right.
says that I exist,
Right. Yeah.
and when he says I, he had something very substantive, no pun
Sure.
intended, in mind.
That's a good one. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's helpful. Maybe we can move on to I don't know how to say this guy's name because it's German, but it's like Corner or Kurner or something. Do you know how to pronounce
Körner, I
Körner?
think is approximately how you say it. Yeah.
Okay. Because we talked about Stroud and we can touch on Stroud too, but I don't know as much about Körner's um, uniqueness proof, and it's basically like he's saying you have to demonstrate. Like I think it's kind of like you take the conceptual line from Stroud's bifurcation of transcendental arguments into world directed and conceptual, and then he says, okay, look, even if you have the conceptual TA, you need a uniqueness proof to show that all of our human conceptual framework is the same. Like, why assume that, Kant kind of assumed that we all have the same categories, or at least that's the public the caricature of him. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. You're the Kant guy. But why assume that we all have the same belief system? Does that sound like it's a fair characterization of Körner's uniqueness objection?
And I'm cheating because I have my own encyclopedia article open.
That's awesome.
It's been a while. Okay, so basically the uniqueness of conceptual framework problem has to do with the inference inside any transcendental argument, which is that I'm thinking of something in a certain way, and that's only possible if such and such else is the case.
Right.
So putting this at the most general level. Okay. But now, anytime you make that kind of inference, you are implicitly saying that there's only one way for this a capacity that we have, or this knowledge that we have, or this thought that we're having. There's only one way for that to be possible.
Right.
Okay. Well, what makes you say that? Why can't there be other paths to that, once again, the thought that we're having, or the capacity that we have, or the knowledge that we have?
Yeah.
So that in general is the uniqueness problem. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's scary for anyone who wants to use a transcendental argument, because it's such a strong claim. You're making such a strong claim, and Kerner just says, well, all we need is a counterexample, or you. I think what he's pushing back and saying, like, prove that universal, that we all have the same categories. I wonder if we could move, just touching on Kant a little bit. A lot of these problems seem like they're turning Kant against themselves. Stroud's argument seems like it's turning Kant on himself, and this one might too, because as far as I know, Kant never gave a reason for why we all have the same categories of understanding. From your study of Kant, making you go way back, does he ever provide a reason? Is that a problem for his philosophy, that we all human beings have the same categories of thought?
That is a problem in Kant. That's a very deep problem in Kant. Now, setting aside, he's got 12 categories there,
Right.
and let's set aside most of those.
Okay.
Too much to do all at once.
Sure.
And let's focus on the ones that he himself was actually most interested in, which are the categories of substance and cause.
Okay.
Because he was inspired to the entire project by Hume, and Hume's questioning of our ever being justified in making claims about causally related substances outside of us.
Right.
much less ourselves as substances. So that gets to the time awareness issue. That's why this is at the heart of Kant, is this issue of our ability to be aware of the time of our own experiences, what he would call subjective time awareness or subjective time determinations. And so this takes us to Kant's refutation of idealism, where he argued that so here's the capacity that the skeptic agrees that we have, right? That the skeptic is committed to, was that the skeptic has a determinate order for his or her own experiences. And indeed, I think it's pretty plausible to say that there's no cognition, there's no coherent thinking at all, unless if you are thinking of your own experiences as occurring in a determinate temporal order. Okay, your own experiences, not stuff outside you yet. Right?
Sure.
Okay. But just like I know first I'm having this thought, and then I'm having this thought, and then I'm having this thought. Okay. Well, that seems pretty basic to our ability to think, or to think coherently about anything. Okay.
Yeah.
So Kant says fine. Okay, so fine. So we want some rock to stand on, like that even the skeptic is committed to. So that's this. So Kant says, all right, can you agree with that? So fine. So then this gets so in the refutation, he says, well, it's precisely because Hume is right that I do not experience my own substantiality. I cannot refer when I'm thinking of what something happened at this time, and something happened at this time, something happened at this time. The only way for me to feel justified in assigning any kind of such order to things is if I'm referring those thought events or experiential events to something else, to something that is relatively permanent. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, but as he says in the refutation, but this permanent that I'm referring my own subjective experiences to cannot be me or in me, because Hume is right. I don't, that's not part of my experience. I am not part of my experience.
Yeah.
But my experience is just my experiences. There's no other thing that I'm aware of, not myself. So therefore, Kant says, the only way for me to even think, to get started in the process of thinking of my own experiences as occurring in a determinate time order, is by referring them to something relatively permanent outside myself.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we have stuff outside me, relatively permanent substances outside me. And furthermore, it's there when we bring in Kant's analogies, it's the perceived causal relations between those things, or the rules governing those things, that tell me what order to put my own experiences in. Yeah. Right. Because the order of my experiences is not the order of things in the world. Like I can remember something that happened 10 years ago, and I don't think of that as happening, now. Right. I think of it as something that I'm remembering that happened 10 years ago. I'm placing it in a time order, but the order in which I think about things is not the order of the things of which I am thinking. Okay. So in order to make that distinction between just the subjective flow of whatever's going through my head and what's really happening out in the real world, is there has to be a world, and that world has to be different from my experiences. Okay. Yeah. So now what we're suggesting, therefore, is just because the skeptic is committed to being able to think of his or her own experiences as occurring in a subjective order, the skeptic is therefore also committed to an external world of causally related substances, obeying not just causally related, but obeying consistent causal laws. Yeah. It's not a world of chaos. Yeah. It has to be a world of law. Okay. So you see, that's the transcendental argument, right? Yep. And you see how it basically is supposed to function. Yeah. Okay. And it's actually really interesting, because the whole argument turns on Kant's concession that we do not. He concedes with Hume to Hume that we do not perceive ourselves as substances, and furthermore, we also don't perceive causal relations between things. Yeah. Right. That those the causal laws that govern the world are somehow presupposed in just my ordering my own experiences in time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really slick, and it's granting the skeptic what they want to start with, and then trying to show them, hoisting them on their own petard there. Um, do you think that's
But
successful? Yeah, please.
no, I
Okay.
don't think it's
Okay.
successful.
All right.
Now, but has Kant therefore demonstrated that a law-like external reality really exists against the skeptic?
Hmm.
Or has Kant simply shown that it's something that we must presuppose?
And there's the Stroud coming through.
This is where Stroud famously argued in the vicinity of 1979 or whenever that book came out. Stroud argued that that's the best you can get out of this kind of argument. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he thought you can establish right. Like he talked about modest transcendental arguments. The modest transcendental arguments is where you're showing that something is conceptually presupposed, that something is always in the back of your head. It's always something that you're supposing the truth of in order to execute some other capacity on your part, or to claim some other knowledge on your part.
Yeah.
But that's the best you can do. You can't actually show that thing is real.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah. So that's what he calls a modest transcendental. I have another idea that there's a third thing that might be more along the lines of what a lot of what Kant was trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
That can also be successfully executed against the skeptic. But I against like the ambitious transcendental arguments, I don't think I can think of any examples where I would be prepared to endorse
Okay.
the most ambitious form.
Yeah.
And there's not many people, I think, now who would. Not many.
I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah. So what's that third thing you were just mentioning?
Oh, well, I've argued in a few different places that one aspect of Kant's project is to show the applicability or legitimacy of certain core concepts that are employed in the natural sciences. So again, substance and causation are the key concepts there.
Yeah.
One way of looking at a variety of key philosophers. Let's just mention three major philosophers that Kant was thinking of: Leibniz, Berkeley, and Hume.
Yep.
Okay. Each in their own way, they questioned the very applicability or legitimacy of the concept of a material substance, right? So for Berkeley, they're ideas, right? Leibniz is a monist. The only thing that really exists are minds, right?
Yeah.
And for Hume, we can sort of believe in those things all we like, but they're not actually judgments, right? We are caused to believe things. For Hume tells a psychological story about belief in things like material substance.
Right.
It's more like a knee-jerk reaction that we believe in these things, right?
Is it like a proto epiphenomenalism? I always wondered about that. Like we're caused to have these beliefs, but we're not actively shaping them. They happen to us.
Why do you call that epiphenomenalism?
Well, my understanding of epiphenomenalism is that that our thoughts, it's like a trick. It's like we think that we're having thoughts and we can choose and make rational choices.
Yeah.
And yet underneath that, it's not. We're causally determined to think those things by material causes, not by. I think there's a form of causal determinism that is right, but not material causes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, so Hume wanted to tell a causal story about belief, and judgment.
Yeah.
And it's basically material determination. Yeah, he was certainly a determinist.
Okay. So those are Kant's three.
Right, okay. So back to that. So what I suggest is that Kant talks about distinguishing between the quid juris and the quid facto, like what's the fact and the entitlement.
Yeah.
Now, one of the key questions he thought with regard to our entitlement to think about things like, are objects real? Am I real? Are objects real? are there natural laws? Okay, so he was worried about these questions for sure. But Berkeley would say that, well, on a certain level, Berkeley called himself a realist, but everyone who reads Berkeley, nobody believes it.
Right.
We're really talking about ideas,
Yeah.
says Berkeley. Okay, so Berkeley's the only person who thought of himself as a realist. Okay, so we're really talking about ideas. So we never really even refer to material substances successfully. Like we're making a mistake, a kind of category mistake.
Mm.
Same thing for Leibniz for totally different reasons,
Yeah.
right? We're
Right.
really always just talking about minds.
Yeah.
Monads.
Little monads.
Right?
Yeah. A bunch
That's
of
all
them.
that exists is monads.
Right.
Right. There's special monads and there's less special monads, but that's all that exists.
Yeah.
So we're never kind of even successfully referring to things, material things, material substances, right? So in that sense, Kant was concerned not just with sort of establishing the existence. Against the Cartesian skeptic, does not question that there could be such a thing,
Yeah,
as a material object. They just think that the Cartesian skeptic, not Descartes, but the Cartesian skeptic says that, well, but we never really know that those things exist because we could be deceived or defective or dreaming or whatever.
right.
Okay. But for Berkeley or for Leibniz, it's not that there couldn't ever have been such a thing, right? Those things don't even make any sense, right? There's no universe where there are material objects.
Right.
Rather those people. And for Hume, this is a totally different story. But for Hume, there could never be any judgment on solid, rational principles or on evidence that there are such things.
Okay.
Right. Indeed. I think for Hume, you don't even really refer to them successfully, because when you write, like with causation, what is causation for Hume? It's really just a feeling of expectation that you project out onto the world.
Right.
It's no more real than color is real, right? Color is a feeling that you get when you see light reflecting at a certain wavelength, and you sort of think it's like, oh, that thing is red, right?
Right.
But there is no such thing as redness. It doesn't even make sense. You're making a category mistake when you say something is red, because redness is a feeling. It's not the sort of thing that an object can have. It's not about being right or wrong, about being mistaken, about the lighting is weird and you thought something was red and it's really purple.
Right.
No, there is no such thing as color, right? And so there's no such thing as a substance either for Hume, because substance is just this kind of like lively connection of ideas. If you get into the whole Hume story as to why we think there's substances, right?
Okay.
Causation is just another kind of lively connection of ideas, an expectation of one type of experience given a certain prior type of experience. So in a manner of speaking, for all of these thinkers, the attribution of substantiality or causality to the world, you're making a kind of category mistake. You're attributing something to the world, not just that you don't know that it has, but that it can't have. It's conceptually incoherent. I think it's a big part of Kant's project, and this is potentially successful on Kant's part.
Okay.
Is to show that these concepts are applicable to the world, that they're legitimate. Because why would, and now this goes back to the story about the refutation. Okay, we can read the refutation of idealism not as against a Cartesian skeptic, but as against this other kind of skeptic who's questioning the legitimacy of the concept. If we can show, as Stroud says you can do, right, that the notion of external material law-like reality is presupposed in the most basic cognitive operation that we do, which is ordering our own experiences in time.
Yeah.
Okay. If that's presupposed in that, then it can't be. It cannot be a category mistake. It cannot be conceptually incoherent to think about the world in that way. Why can't it be? Because we have to think about the world. That's the only way to think about the world.
Yeah.
So there is no other way to think about the world. It's the folks who question that who are being conceptually incoherent. They are committed to thinking. Leibniz and Berkeley and Hume are committed to thinking about the world that way. Although Hume actually might even actually agree with that. But so we might be able to establish through the more modest means, right?
Yeah.
The legitimacy of certain concepts. Legitimacy.
Yeah. All
right. Not necessarily their instantiation in reality, but their legitimacy, and that is an accomplishment.
Well, and it sounds like an accomplishment, but it also sounds like that might help Kant around the problem of categories. Like, why do we all have the same categories? Well, because that's just what it means to think. And if you're going to think, then you're going to have at least those two categories that we're considering right now. And so there is
Yes.
no problem of, well, why do you, Dr. Bardon and Parker, why do you guys have the same categories? No, because we're both thinkers.
Yes. I think that you would, by extension, he would hope to tell that same story about all of his categories.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. I can't go through them one by one. He didn't really go through them one by one necessarily either.
Right.
He really kind of honed in on the things he was obviously most concerned about was like substance and cause.
Yeah.
And then eventually things like freedom and morality and the self.
Yeah.
But those are all along for the ride. And he would say generally that all those categories are somehow kind of necessary to the thought process itself. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. So, you got me all intrigued about Kant now. So, he's got his 12 categories, but then he's got time and space, and those are not categories, right?
No.
And what does he call those? I forgot the language he used.
Forms of intuition. They're forms of experience.
Forms
all
of
outer experience is spatial, and all experience, including inner experience, is temporal.
Okay. And I wanted to, since you've done some work on time as well, is there any kind of A theory or B theory in Kant? Is there any kind of theory of time in him, or is he just getting at like the personal experience of time?
Okay, so A theory and B theory. Maybe I should explain to your viewers.
Please. Yeah, that'd be great.
A little bit what you're referring to. Okay, so in short, the A series or A theory states that time dynamically passes. And that there's also therefore a unique present, and that what is present and what events are present changes over time. So the B theory denies that, and the B theory says that there's such a thing as temporal order, but in fact there's no unique present, and that all events have the same status. This is consistent. It's a long story. This is entirely what Einstein's theory of relativity says about the universe, and is broadly accepted, in fact, in the world of physics, right, that we live in what's called a block universe, and from different in different frames of reference, different sets of events are simultaneous with each other, or are what we call, or are present to our experience at that time. So B theory states that there's a kind of temporal order out there, but there's no dynamic process happening out there that is the passage of time. Mm-hmm. So that's 20th century stuff. That was not, so it would be anachronistic to say that Kant was really kind of focused on that distinction specifically. I have written about what you could get out of Kant on this topic, though. I think that this getting into Kant's aesthetic, the first major section of the Critique of Pure Reason, I think you could get out of Kant the idea that the passage of time is presupposed in our manner of thinking, in our way of putting ideas together, mm-hmm, and in our self-conception of our own experience. And this goes to this, by the way, goes to Kasim Kassam, who I know you've had on your show, has a very nice book where he talks about this in relation to Kant, that it would be difficult to imagine how we could make sense out of our own experience unless we thought of ourselves as being limited spatially and temporally to what we can, sort of what is available to us at any given moment. And so this is straight out of Kassam's Mind and World, which is a lovely book.
Yeah.
So that would include, I think, this notion that so time dynamically passes, or sorry, the presupposition that time dynamically passes is part of our way of thinking about our own experience.
Yeah.
Because if we thought that all of time was available to us all the time, and there were no limitations on that, there would be no way for us to take any set of mental contents that we have and make any sense of the world out of them.
Yeah.
Right. So our self-conception is kind of limited. And the same thing for space, right? If I could see everything in the universe all at once, and every moment in the universe all at once, well, I couldn't figure out what's happening right now. What am I supposed to do right now?
Yeah.
Is it time for lunch? I don't know.
Yeah. So does that mean that the phenomenal noumenal distinction, right? So in our phenomenal understanding of the world, we do have a temporal passage of time, like an atheist, but does that leave it open that it might be B theory in the noumena, or it might be A theory that we just don't have the epistemic access or something?
I think all I've said in representing Kant is talking about what we're presupposing when we sort of represent our own experience. I strongly I'm totally reject the A theory just based on what I know about physics. I think it's rather conclusively indicates that the A theory is wrong. There's also just tremendous when you get into it. There's tremendous like logical problems with actually thinking of the world as being a theoretic, as being dynamic in that way, as shown by people like Parmenides way back in the day, the pre-Socratic, up through McTaggart, the famous early 20th century philosopher. So I'm entirely on board with what we call B theory and the block universe. I'm also, but that's consistent with saying that I can't help but think about the world in dynamic terms. That's the way I'm so constituted. Those two things are consistent.
Okay.
But that's once again, so this is a modest, this is a modest claim in the sense of the modest transcendental argument. This is what's presupposed by my way of thinking about my own experience. But it would be a different thing to say that I therefore have proven that the world must be set that way.
Right. Yeah. Is there any way to know? It's hard to know how far to take Kant, right? Is there any way to get to the thing in itself? Are we able to see past our conceptual framework at all to the real world? Is there able, like, if the atheoretic view of time is what's presupposed, how can we ever get past and say, but actually in reality it's B theory, physics is right?
Well, indeed, that's a super deep question, and and Kant, Kant, like many things, he wasn't the first one to make this distinction between the world as we know it and the world as it is in itself, and to have noted that, well, if the world, whenever I refer to the world as the world as I conceive of it, how can I possibly even ask the question, well, what is the world like when I abstract away from the conditions under which I experience and conceive of it?
Mm-hmm.
I sure don't see how we, by definition, you can't meaningfully talk about the world as it is in itself, right?
Okay.
The world as it in itself, by definition, is that which you can't talk about.
Yeah.
Right. If you could talk about it, then it would be the phenomenal world.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that the really interesting thing that I think that comes out of that is this difference is the issue of scientific realism versus scientific instrumentalism.
Yes.
Okay. So scientific realism is the view that when we talk about things like electrons and natural laws, that we're actually describing the world simpliciter, right? We're describing the world as it is in itself. And
Mm-hmm.
scientific instrumentalism is that, well, the best you can ever do is kind of make a model, make predictions on the basis of that model of the world, and there could and those predictions might be good or bad, might work out or might not work out. In that case, you got a good model, but there would, in principle, there'd always be alternative models describing different laws and different entities out there that might in principle work out just as well as your model. So in other words, there's never some final description of the universe as it is in itself.
Right.
And I it's very hard to see how to maintain the strong realist view of our scientific description of reality, given the kinds of concerns that Kant is raising. I think there's a whenever we picture the world, we're picturing it in a certain way, and there's certain conceptual presuppositions, and there's a way for us to interact with the world, and that's always going to be part of an essential part of our description of the world, right? And you can't step outside of that. I don't know how to get from that.
It's crazy. Yeah, I think it's right. And some of us think about this when we're kids, and we're like, how can I ever think about the world from over there in the corner or outside my perspective, and I think it's interesting too, because people today will say, well, ducks use electromagnetism and that's how they can migrate to the same spot every year. And it's like, oh, that's cool. So look, the world is, there's a noumenal world out there. And you go, yeah, but you just told me that. And I was able to think of that. So that's still in the phenomenal realm. Like you haven't, just because you've gotten to infrared light or electromagnetism or some other sense that an animal has that I don't, if I'm able to conceive of that, isn't that still in the phenomenal? We haven't gotten past, or have we? Maybe have we gotten past knowing that sharks use different senses and stuff? Is that into the human itself?
Well, yeah. But when you imagine though, well, what's it like? What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a shark? What is it like to be a duck? It's always going to be in our experiential terms. If you imagine like what does magnetism feel like? Well, the best you can do is going to be some kind of a hum or some kind of light or something that you're familiar with, right?
Right.
I can imagine myself in another time and space. I can imagine being you right now in Illinois, looking at a computer screen.
Yeah.
And with a much more impressive backdrop than I have in my office.
Thank you.
Nice set of lovely gilded books you got there. So but that's in spatiotemporal terms that I'm familiar with.
Right.
That's all drawing on experience that I've had. So when it gets to and I can imagine much more being in the point of view of much more extravagant things, but there's always going to be kind of this sort of conceptual, as Kant would say, like whatever it's all going to be, whatever is in my mind, it's going to like be under these categories.
Right.
I'm going to be telling it there's going to be substance, there's going to be cause, there's going to be a modal. I'm going to be either imagining something necessary or possible or hypothetical. It's going to have a certain qualitative aspect. It's going to have a certain quantitative aspect to it. I'm running through a lot of Kant's categories.
Yeah, we're getting them. You said you weren't going to go there, but I got you to go through his categories anyways.
I don't know if there had to be exactly those 12 or something. Right. He was really obsessed with the number 12.
Yeah, he was.
But it's for a lot of those things, at least it looks like, well, these are basic kind of conceptual building blocks for thought and experience. So for thought, yes, and then the spatiotemporal part goes to, well, if you want to make it experiential, it's going to be spatiotemporal, and the categories are going to be organizing or going to be contributing to your spatiotemporal picture. But it's always going to be space and time and modality and causation. And there's no way to agree. Well, what's the world like without that stuff?
Right. Yeah, it's just not going to happen. Yeah. To even think about that, because thought presupposes these other things. Yeah. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the big implications, as Kant was, his main concern was natural science here, at least in the first two sections of the Critique of Pure Reason, right? Mm-hmm. So what are the implications for science? I think that's what's really interesting here.
Yeah. Does if you were to follow Kant, would you be a scientific operationalist? Is that like where you're
an instrumentalist?
Instrumentalist, sorry, yeah.
I don't see any alternative.
Okay.
A lot of scientists and indeed philosophers of science don't like that.
No, yeah, I could see.
There's real dissent about that. I don't see how you can be a full-on realist in that sense of scientific realism.
Well, if you were to pitch it as like instrumentalism is not, it's just cutting off the noumena. It's cutting off, and the noumena is not interpretable because it doesn't have what we just talked about. It doesn't have these categories of thought. So yeah, if you have a problem, if you're committed to scientific realism, you think, well, now you're an anti-realist or something like that, you're leaving us in skepticism. Well, yeah, sure, I'm leaving us in skepticism about the noumenal realm, which is not able to be thought about, which doesn't seem like that big of a deal.
That is exactly what Kant says.
Okay.
He says I'm not an idealist. I'm a transcendental idealist, which means I'm an idealist about what transcends any possible experience, right? Yeah. I'm an idealist in terms of talking about that. But I'm an empirical realist, he said.
Yeah.
I'm a realist about the world as we know it. Mm-hmm. Right? Think of that phrase as all hyphenated, the world as we know it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay? But and that the world as we know it is categorical and it's spatiotemporal, right?
Right.
But that's the world that science is describing.
Right.
It's not trying to describe some other world, God's realm or
Uh-huh.
whatever
Yeah.
transcendent realm that is, right? It's describing the world as we know it, and it can be either successful or unsuccessful at doing that.
Yeah.
Do you make a model that makes successful predictions? Have you successfully captured all the phenomena you're trying to capture? We have these criteria for success here,
Yeah.
and so Kant says, yeah, I'm a realist. And we win. The skeptic is defeated.
Yeah. I've never thought about transcendental idealism in this way before. You really opened up my eyes towards this, because I've always thought, yeah, it's a popular canard of Kant saying, he's replaced one form of skepticism with another, because transcendental idealism doesn't really tell us about the world. But when you pitch it like this, it's like it tells us about the world that you are able to experience, which is what you can't escape from anyways. So maybe, I don't know. I thought that's really interesting, and you definitely illumined me on Kant right now. I'm gonna have to go back and read the critique again, man. This is a whole different perspective for me. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that was the whole strategy there, and I mean, his critics from the beginning, his critics says, no, this is just idealism again.
Right.
And but that was what he was. That was his fundamental strategy. Yeah, it was to drive that wedge between the hard idealists,
right,
and the more like pragmatic idealists.
Yeah. Well, so if I'm not mistaken, then there's at least one transcendental argument, which is conceptual, which does work, and it succeeds. It's valuable to us, right? Like his transcendental refutation of idealism.
I think it arguably may be successful at establishing a certain conceptual presupposition.
Okay.
Which in turn, if you buy the empirical realism transcendental idealism distinction, would entitle you to describe the world as actually being a law-like world of material substances.
Yeah.
If you say it all that way,
that's quite a thing to say.
Then maybe so.
Okay.
But it's not at all kind of like it's not exactly what the sort of ambitious anti-Cartesian he had a problem with Descartes. He thought that Descartes' demand was the wrong demand in the first place. Descartes wanted knowledge. If we were going to have knowledge of the world, it would have to be the knowledge of the world as it is in itself.
Right.
And he thought that was the wrong demand. So he's not answering that demand. If that's what you want, then you're not going to get that. Okay. But he would argue that was the wrong question in the first place.
Yeah. Just as we close up here and we touch back on Descartes, I've always been interested and kind of confused about what Kant means when he says, every thought like presupposes the I, or has, I forgot the exact language. Do you know what I'm referring to? In Kant?
In Kant, every thought proposes the I. Oh, right. Okay.
The I,
yes,
right.
This is in the I think is that's in the
I think. Sorry. Yeah.
The I think.
Right. The I think. And to me, I'm like, well, that seems like it resonates with the cogito, but I guess Kant said you can't know the self. It's a transcendental unity of perception or something maybe. But is that the difference in that Descartes thought you could know the I, and Kant said no, it's presupposed, but you can't know it?
Kant was very consciously distinguishing himself from Descartes there.
Right.
That the I think is a it's thinkable but not experienceable. It is a noumenal self. Yes.
Okay.
And it's presupposed. It's not something that is experienced. It's not something that can be sort of like proven through some kind of like weird metaphysical deduction. Indeed, you don't do it. You need a transcendental deduction.
Sure.
That you're showing that it's a conceptual presupposition of experience itself. In order for me to make sense of my own experience, just as I was saying about space and time, in order to make sense of my own experience, I sort of have to think of myself as enduring through my experiences.
Okay.
As an entity, as an experiencing entity. I have to think of thoughts. I can't think of thoughts as free flowing. I have to attach them to a thinker.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing as proving that the Cartesian self exists.
Is it
And
just
he would be very careful to say that he was not claiming to have done that.
and that's so I know that he was distinguishing from Descartes, but right there it sounds like you're taking the weakened version of Descartes, there's thinking going on, and saying, well, Kant said if there's thinking going on, there's a thinker, right? And that it's just super confusing for me because it seems like if you take those two in conjunction, then you have proven the self. I'm totally wrong here.
Not the self as a member of the world.
Yes, because it's in the noumena.
Yeah. Descartes wanted a substantial self. Like the self is like there. It's not. I'm not sure if it's in space or not for Descartes. I've always been confused about that.
Yeah,
I'm not sure he really thought that through either. But
maybe not.
It's like it's there in the world. Like the self is like a thing.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he was a strong, substance dualist.
Yeah.
And that Kant would be very careful to distinguish what he's doing from that, right? He's saying it's more like a concept that must be presupposed in the thought of experience itself. Mm-hmm. Very different from saying I've established that there is a thing in the world that will furthermore, exist after I die. Later on he talks about how I can hope for that.
Right. Yeah.
If you get to the end of the
third, is that the third critique or is that still the first?
It's the third section of the first critique. It's in the Transcendental Dialectic and the Canon of Pure Reason.
Okay. Yeah, I got some homework now. I got to go back and
and then he really needs that because that's how he gets. We have to be able to hope or conceive of libertarian freedom, and then his whole moral theory depends on the possibility or the conceivability of libertarian freedom.
Yeah.
So a lot is resting on that tenuous, non-substantial I think. A lot is resting.
Wow, man.
Ultimately.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Bardon, this has been huge, man. I appreciate you so much for going back to Transcendental Arguments that you've done work on in the past, and thanks for recalling that. And then, thanks for sharing more about your study on Kant and some time. Maybe we'll have to have you back on to talk about your more current work in time. That'd be fascinating too. Time freaks me out. It really blows my mind. It's insane. And everyone on both sides, A theorists and B theorists, always think the other ones are crazy. You guys you're always well, A theory is crazy. And you've said a little bit here, but the A theorists think that the B theorists are insane and that there's that the self is like this worm thing stretched across, and then it's crazy. And I'm in the middle here trying to make sense of all this while you guys are throwing grenades. So it would be great to have you back on to talk about time and help me think through this.
Well, anytime. It's really been fun, Parker.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's going to have to do it, folks. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.